In 1923, the Osage Nation of Oklahoma was per capita the wealthiest community on Earth. They owned automobiles, the finest models available, Packards and Pierce Arrows, and hired white chauffeurs to drive them. They built mansions on the rolling hills of Osage County. They wore jewelry. They traveled. Their children went to schools back east. At the height of the oil boom, a single Osage headright, the share of oil royalty income that every tribal member received, was worth several $million. There were Osage families in Fairfax and Pawhuska living in a way that would have been unimaginable a generation before, in a way that their white neighbors watched with an attention that was not entirely friendly. And they were dying. Quietly, systematically, one by one, a bullet in the back of the head, a poison worked slowly into a cup of coffee, a house reduced to splinters by dynamite before sunrise. Between 1921 and 1926, more than 60 Osage people were killed or died under circumstances that no honest investigator could call natural. The local authorities investigated and found nothing. Private detectives were hired and were bought off or frightened off or simply disappeared into the same silence that had swallowed everything else. The Osage Tribal Council wrote to the federal government asking for help. The letters sat. This is not a story about a crime that was hidden. The murders were happening in plain sight in a county of 12,000 people, in a community where everyone knew everyone and everyone knew who held power. It is a story about a system, about the particular kind of evil that does not need to hide, because the law has already agreed to look the other way. About what happens when the machinery of government is turned against the people it was built to protect. And about one woman who sat in the middle of all of it, watching the people she loved disappear one by one, unable to do anything about it, because the law had already decided she was not capable of making her own decisions. Her name was Molly Burkhart, and this is her story as much as it is anyone's. To understand what happened to the Osage, you have to understand how they came to be where they were. The Osage Nation had once occupied a vast territory across the central United States, present-day Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, parts of Oklahoma. Over the course of the 19th century, through a series of treaties that the United States made and then revised when they became inconvenient, the Osage were pushed steadily south and west. In 1870, the federal government moved them to a reservation in northeastern Oklahoma, a tract of rocky, hilly land that white settlers had passed over because it seemed poor for farming, poor for grazing, poor for most of the things that made land valuable to the people doing the moving. The Osage bought this land outright, with money from the sale of their Kansas territory. That distinction matters. They did not receive it. They purchased it. The land was theirs in a way that could not be entirely undone even when everything around it was being undone. In the 1890s, oil was discovered beneath that rocky, hilly, supposedly worthless ground. By the terms of the Osage Allotment Act of 1906, the subsurface mineral rights of the reservation were held collectively by the tribe. Every enrolled member received an equal share of the royalty income, a headright. The headrights were hereditary. When an Osage died, their headright passed to their legal heir. And under the law as written in 1906, that heir could be anyone Osage or not. That last provision was the mechanism of everything that followed. By 1923, the Osage were receiving more than $30 million per year in oil royalties, divided among the approximately 2,000 enrolled headright holders. The money came in quarterly payments, large checks that arrived like clockwork that made Osage County one of the richest places in America by any measure. The white men who had come to Osage County for the oil boom, the cattlemen, the lawyers, the businessmen, the drifters looking for opportunity, looked at those checks and saw something. They saw that if an Osage person died, their head right passed to their heir. And if that heir was a white man who had married into the family, the head right passed to him. And if a whole family died, if they could be eliminated one by one with enough patience and planning, a single man could accumulate head rights worth millions of dollars a year indefinitely for the rest of his life. All it required was the willingness to do what needed to be done. And one more thing, it required the law to cooperate. In 1921, the United States Congress passed a law that would make everything that followed not only possible, but easy. The law established a system of financial guardianship over the Osage. Any tribal member deemed incompetent to manage their own affairs would be assigned a guardian, almost always a white man who would control their finances. The guardian would receive the head right payments, manage the accounts, approve expenditures, and determine what the ward could and could not spend their own money on. The designation of incompetency was not based on any individual assessment of mental capacity or financial ability. It was based in practice almost entirely on blood quantum. Full-blooded Osage were presumed incompetent. Mixed-blood Osage were generally not. The reasoning as laid out in congressional testimony and agency reports of the time was the language of the era. The assumption stated plainly and without apparent embarrassment that full-blooded Indians lacked the capacity to manage the affairs of civilized life. Molly Burkhart was full-blooded Osage. She was 35 years old in 1921, a woman who had already navigated 2 marriages, raised children, and managed her family's considerable affairs with no apparent difficulty. She was by every account that survives a person of considerable intelligence and practical ability. Under the new law, she was incompetent. Her finances were placed under the guardianship of her husband, Ernest Burkhart. Ernest Burkhart was the nephew of William King Hale. Imagine for a moment what it meant to live inside that system. To be a woman of wealth and intelligence whose family had owned this land for 50 years, who had watched her nation accumulate the kind of riches that drew the entire world's attention, and to be told by the government of the country that had pushed you onto this land in the first place that you were not capable of signing your own checks, that you needed permission to buy medicine for your mother, that you could not travel to Washington to speak to the president about the deaths of your neighbors without the approval of the man who was, unbeknownst to you, orchestrating those deaths. That is the world Molly Burkhart was living in, not as metaphor, as the literal structure of her daily life. Molly Kyle was born in December 1886, the daughter of Lizzie Q. Kyle, a full-blooded Osage woman who had inherited multiple head rights and was by 1921 of the wealthiest individuals in Osage County. Molly grew up in the world of the Osage. The ceremonies, the language, the particular rhythms of life on the reservation that persisted even as the oil money transformed everything around it. She had a quality that people who knew her described consistently: a stillness, a watchfulness, the quality of a person who observes more than she speaks and retains everything she observes. She had married once before, Ernest, a man named Henry Roan, a marriage that ended in divorce. In 1917, she married Ernest Burkhart, a young white man who had come to Osage County with his uncle, William Hale, and found work as a taxi driver and odd jobsman. Ernest was charming in the loose, easy way of men who have learned early that charm is a more reliable tool than industry. He made Molly laugh. He seemed to love her. They had 3 children. William Hale Ernest's uncle was by 1917 a fixture of Osage County in a way that took years to build and required a specific kind of performance to maintain. He called himself the King of the Osage Hills, not as a joke, but as a description of how he understood his position. He had learned to speak Osage. He attended Osage funerals and Osage celebrations. He offered loans when Osage families needed money. He was godfather to Osage children. He was to all visible appearances the white man most committed to the welfare of the Osage nation. The friend, the patron, the dependable presence in hard times. He was also, as investigators would later establish, the architect of a plan to murder Molly Burkhart's entire family. The plan was not complicated in its logic, though it required extraordinary patience and a particular coldness of mind to execute. Molly's family held multiple head rights. If they died, those head rights would pass to Molly. If Molly died, they would pass to Ernest. If Ernest died without children of sufficient Osage blood, they would eventually pass to Hale. The plan required eliminating people in the correct order, slowly enough not to attract attention all at once, and managing the legal machinery of wills and guardianships to ensure that the head rights flowed in the right direction at each step. Hale had been planning it, investigators later determined, for years before the first body was found. In May of 1921, a man riding through a ravine in the hills north of Fairfax found the body of Anna Brown. Anna was Molly's older sister. She was 35 years old. She had been drinking in the days before her death. She had a problem with alcohol, as many people in Osage County did in those years, as the money and the dislocation of rapid change worked on a community that had been pushed and pulled and rearranged too many times in too few generations. She had been seen arguing with someone the night she disappeared. When the undertaker prepared her body, he found a bullet hole in the back of her head. The investigation went nowhere. There were no witnesses willing to speak. The local sheriff asked questions and received answers that explained nothing and committed no one to anything. Anna Brown was buried, and the case went cold within weeks. 2 months later, Lizzie Q. Kyle, Molly's mother, the woman who had accumulated those multiple head rights across a lifetime, became ill. She had been in reasonable health for a woman of her age. She declined steadily over the following weeks in the specific pattern of someone being given small doses of poison over a sustained period. She died in July 1921. The cause of death was recorded as a wasting illness. Molly's family was now smaller by 2. Their head rights had come to Molly. Ernest Burkhart's guardianship over his wife's finances had just become more valuable. Henry Roan, Molly's first husband, the man she had divorced but remained on reasonable terms with, was found shot to death in his automobile in February 1923. Hale had taken out a life insurance policy on Roan years earlier, naming himself as beneficiary. The policy paid out $25,000. In March 1923, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the house of William and Rita Smith exploded. Rita Smith was Molly's younger sister. She and her husband William and their servant Nettie Brookshire were all killed in the blast. The explosion was caused by nitroglycerin packed beneath the house's foundation. Someone had placed it there carefully while the family slept. In 3 years, Molly Burkhart had lost her mother, 2 sisters, a former husband, a brother-in-law, and a household servant. Each death had been explained inadequately by something other than murder. Each death had increased the value of the head rights now concentrated in Molly's name and under Ernest's guardianship. Molly was, by the time the Smith house came down, beginning to be ill herself. She was tired in a way that rest did not fix. She had pains that moved around her body without settling. Her thinking at times felt slow and resistant. She mentioned these symptoms to people around her, including to Ernest, who expressed concern and arranged medical attention. The doctors who examined her found nothing conclusive. The illness persisted. It would be years before investigators established what Molly's family and neighbors had begun to suspect, that Ernest Burkhart had been on William Hale's instruction introducing small amounts of poison into his wife's food. The guardianship system that gave him control of her finances also in practice gave him control of everything she ate and drank. He was the person closest to her. He was the person who expressed the most concern for her health. He was in the eyes of the law her protector. The Osage Tribal Council had been writing letters to the federal government since 1921. The letters described what was happening, the deaths, the pattern, the impossibility of getting local authorities to investigate seriously. The letters asked for federal agents to be sent. The letters sat in offices and were passed between departments and generated responses that acknowledged receipt and promised attention and produced nothing. In April 1923, following the Smith House explosion and the resulting outcry, the newly formed Bureau of Investigation, the agency that would become the FBI, assigned agents to the case. The lead investigator was a man named Tom White, a former Texas Ranger who had the particular quality useful in that kind of work. He was patient, he was difficult to corrupt, and he understood that getting people to talk in a community held in silence by terror required time and the building of trust that could not be hurried. He came to Osage County, and he stayed. He recruited undercover agents who infiltrated the social world around William Hale, attending the same gatherings, drinking in the same establishments, slowly mapping the network of relationships and debts and loyalties that held Hale's operation together. It took 2 years. What White found when the full picture finally came into view was not primarily a story of individual murders, though it was certainly that. It was a story of infrastructure. Hale had not simply hired killers. He had built a system within the existing system using the mechanisms of law and commerce that white society had created. Guardianships, insurance policies, wills, legal marriages, property transfers. He had bribed local officials so thoroughly that the machinery of law enforcement in Osage County ran in his favor as a matter of routine. He had corrupted the lawyers who handled Osage estates, the doctors who signed death certificates, the judges who approved guardianship arrangements. He had made murder not an exception to the order of things, but an extension of it. When Ernest Burkhart finally broke, when he was confronted with enough evidence that maintaining his story became impossible, he told investigators what he knew about his uncle's operation. The confession was detailed, and it was damning, and it implicated not just the men who had pulled triggers and laid wires, but the broader network of cooperation and silence that had allowed it to continue for years. Hale was arrested in 1925. His trial, prolonged by legal maneuvers and the difficulty of finding jurors in Oklahoma who were not connected to his network, finally concluded in January 1929. He was convicted of ordering the murder of Henry Roan, just one of the 60-plus deaths attributed to his operation, and sentenced to life in prison. He was paroled in 1947. He was 66 years old and in good health. He lived another 21 years. He is buried in Wichita, Kansas. Ernest Burkhart received a life sentence and was paroled the same year as his uncle. He was later re-imprisoned after robbing another member of the Burkhart family, paroled again in 1957, and spent the rest of his life in Oklahoma. His and Molly's son James refused to see him. The wound did not heal. Of the 60 or more Osage killed during the Reign of Terror, only 4 convictions were ever obtained, covering a fraction of the deaths. The others, the dozens of men and women whose lives ended in ravines and explosions, and the slow accumulation of poison, were never the subject of any criminal proceeding. Their killers in most cases were never identified, by any official body, were never charged, were never asked to account for what they had done. Molly Burkhart recovered her health after investigators removed her from Ernest's household and custody and placed her under medical care in 1926. An agent's report noted with a clinical flatness that contains its own horror that after she was removed from Burkhart's control, she immediately regained her health. The poison administered by her husband over years had been making her sick. When it stopped, she got better. She divorced Ernest in 1926. She married a man named John Cobb in 1928. In 1931, she successfully sued to end her guardianship and regain control of her own finances, the money that had always been hers, the head rights that her mother had accumulated and passed to her, the oil wealth that the government of the United States had decided for 10 years she was not capable of managing herself. She had 6 years of financial independence before she died in June 1937 at the age of 50. The cause of her relatively early death has never been definitively established. The years of poisoning had done what sustained poisoning does. Her body had been through more than a body should be asked to bear. She is buried at the Gray Horse Indian Village Cemetery in Osage County, Oklahoma. Her granddaughter Margie Burkhart still lives in the county. I want to say something about the guardianship system because I think it is the part of this story that most resists the comfortable resolution of focusing on William Hale. Hale was a monster. That is true, and it is important, and it should be said plainly. But Hale did not create the guardianship system. Hale did not write the law that said full-blooded Osage were incompetent to manage their own affairs. Hale did not design the inheritance rules that allowed head rights to pass to non-Osage spouses. Hale did not appoint the corrupt judges and lawyers who ran the guardian system for their own benefit. The 1924 Indian Rights Association report found that Osage people were, in its words, being shamelessly and openly robbed in a scientific and ruthless manner by their court-appointed guardians. That was the ordinary operation of the system before Hale added murder to it. The system was built by the United States Congress in legislation passed with the specific purpose of managing the wealth of people the government had decided were not fully capable of being persons under the law. Hale understood the system better than almost anyone, and he used it with a precision that was almost admirable in its coldness. But he was using a machine that was already running. He didn't build the machine. He just knew what it could do, and he did it. That distinction matters for the question of what the Osage Reign of Terror actually was. If it was just William Hale, just one greedy, murderous man, and his hired killers, then it is a crime story with a beginning and a middle and an end with justice of a sort delivered and a lesson learned. If it is also the guardianship system, the inheritance laws, the judges and lawyers who operated the machinery of dispossession for decades, then it is something larger and harder to resolve. 26% of Osage head rights today are held by non-Osage people or institutions. Some of those head rights were acquired through the marriages and deaths and legal transfers of the 1920s. The descendants of the people who used those mechanisms are still receiving payments. The system that made those transfers possible was not repealed until 1978, 57 years after Anna Brown was found with a bullet in the back of her head. In 2011, the federal government paid the Osage Nation $380 million in restitution for oil royalties that had been mismanaged and stolen through the Guardian system over decades. It was not called a payment for the murders. The murders officially had been accounted for with 4 convictions and 3 life sentences, all paroled. The $380 million was for the money. The money and the murders are not separate things. They were the same plan executed through different instruments, some illegal, some not. That is what the Osage Reign of Terror was, a conspiracy that moved fluidly between the legal and the illegal, that used the structures of law when they served the purpose and bypassed them. When they didn't, that was enabled at every point by a government that had already decided the Osage were not quite full persons under the law. Pawhuska and Fairfax still stand in Osage County, Oklahoma. The oil is not gone, though. The great days of the boom are long past, and the head right payments are a fraction of what they were in 1923. The Osage Nation has its government and its cultural institutions and its language preservation programs and its ceremonies that have continued through everything, through removal and poverty and sudden wealth and murder and the slow drainage of that wealth back out, through the systems designed to drain it. The Gray Horse Indian Village Cemetery is still there. Molly Burkhart is buried there, as are members of her family. The reservation that the Osage bought with their own money in 1870, that the government told them was worthless, that turned out to contain the oil that made them the richest people in the world, and that made them a target for the full range of what greed can produce in human beings, that land is still theirs. That has not been taken. William Hale's grave is in Wichita, Kansas. There is no marker for what he did. There is no accounting in any official register of the 60 or more people who died, so that he and others like him could accumulate the head rights of a community that had been told by the government that they needed protecting. What the Osage needed protecting from, it turned out, was the protectors. That is the question this story leaves behind, not the question of William Hale, who has been judged inadequately, but formally by a court of law. The question of the system, of who builds a law that calls a people incompetent, that strips them of the ability to manage their own money, that places their wealth in the hands of the people who want to take it, and whether that law and the people who wrote it and enforced it and profited from it are ever asked to account for what they made possible. The answer in the case of the Osage is no. Hale was convicted in 1929. The system that enabled him was not repealed for another 50 years. The money that flowed through that system in the decades between flowed where it flowed. Some of it is still flowing. Molly Burkhart spent 10 years inside a legal structure that treated her as incompetent while it helped kill her family. She got 6 years of freedom before her body gave out. She was 50 years old. The oil is still there. The land is still theirs. What was taken from them is not.